Hello, and welcome to Escaping Dystopia. My name is Wah. I'll be your host for tonight. Today is August 8th, 2020. Tonight's episode is entitled 86 Ways to 86 Your Biggest Mistake. And there's the show. Looking good. Sounding alright. We will mute that one so we don't get crazy feedback and then drop links as we need to right here. So it's been an interesting few days. We got 86 days left until the election. The last few days have been a whirlwind, once again, of odd political activity and strange statements. More information coming out. We've got three major thrusts of things we're going to talk about this evening. COVID, of course. Corruption. We're seeing some activity by our government that should be concerning for everybody. I'll do a number of links and stories about those. And a bit about our economy and the situation we're in. I think a lot of people don't quite realize how bad it is, or going to show up here. We just had, on the last shows, we talked a little bit about the second quarter results. We'll see the end of the third quarter in September, and then the reports will be coming out in October. The numbers are going to be weird in a lot of places, and we'll talk a little bit more about that. So let's start out with talking some election coverage. We did some, let me link this right away. I linked, here, I'll start with that. My school that I went to, Trinity University, down in San Antonio, Texas, had a live feed the other day. Here's a link to it. This was talking about the election interference and some of the stuff that's been going on lately. I will also, let me link a little bit more on this. This is a story about how NBC was removing a troll farm that was posting as Black Lives Matter. Folks, it's really, excuse me. Sorry. It says Facebook removed hundreds of accounts on Thursday. This was August 6th, so a couple days ago, from the foreign troll farm posing as African Americans in support of Donald Trump and QAnon supporters. It also removed hundreds of fake accounts linked to conservative media outlet The Epoch Times and that pushed pro-Trump conspiracy theories about coronavirus and protests in the U.S. So social media companies are being a little bit more proactive this time around about the complete and utter horse that shows up in a lot of their places. So they removed this group. A lot of these just sock puppet fakes groups. And if you watch that video that I posted in the first link there, it has a great rundown of just different terms, some of the techniques that are used here. This stuff is real. This is 21st century informational warfare between state actors. We'll talk a little bit more about the specifics that we had here. YouTube this week also had to ban what they call coordinates influence operations. These are interesting. It says YouTube has banned a large number of Chinese accounts that said were engaging in coordinated influence operations on political issues. The company announced today 2,596 accounts from China alone were taken down from April to June. And then that's compared to, so this is more, they're doing these updates on their continuing operations to deal with this. This has just been a really interesting aspect of social media as we move to the 21st century, and you have these things that become so large and powerful and useful that, of course, large and powerful things use them. One of the ideas early on was that a lot of the internet capabilities, because they were so ubiquitous, because the network effects were so powerful, because they were outside of government control, or at least traditional government control, they would lead to a lot of societal upheaval, which has happened. We're seeing now a little bit more of that other side as now governments are learning how to use those tools to control and manipulate populaces, both their own and others. So we also had U.S. intelligence services this week come out, because it's kind of been bubbling again about how much the Russians are going to try and impact the elections. The issue that you have right now is the Director of National Intelligence is a Donald stooge, and so is the other guy. I mean, really, these were people who auditioned for these jobs during the impeachment hearings and said some really ridiculous stuff about what the president's able to do with foreign powers, like openly solicit help with his re-election campaign, which is what he got impeached for. So those people are now running, at least nominally, the intelligence services of the United States. So as all these reports start coming out about continued influence operations and how the Russians and Putin would very much like to see Donald back in power, it puts them in a weird spot. They released this report, and it said Russia is working to undermine Democrat Joe Biden. Said ahead of the 2020 elections, foreign states will continue to use covert and overt influence measures in their attempts to sway U.S. voter preferences and perspectives, shift U.S. policies, increase discord in the United States, and undermine the American people's confidence in our democratic process. One of the things that they never really, and this is one of the things that had been so frustrating about how, when the last election cycle worked out, was that we never really got the clear notice that they had a purpose, right? There was always that, oh, well, both sides, a lot of those Russian trolls were also trying to help Bernie out, and it was one of those things that was such a dishonest argument, because the only reason they were trying to help Bernie was after he had lost the primary in order to hurt Hillary. And the dynamics of the situation, this whole both sides thing, was always extremely sketchy. And now they're talking about how, Russia's doing it, China's doing it, and all this. While the intelligence assessment does show that other countries would have a preference, right, in the election, and China has a really interesting preference, because on the one hand, they know that if Donald continues to be in charge of the U.S. is going to continue to slide down tremendously and could very well lead to war. On the other hand, if Donald stays, it could very lead to war. I don't think China wants a war with the U.S., and I think they've realized that Donald doesn't really care, per se, and would gladly sacrifice most of the world and all of China to avoid really responsibility or repercussions for another week. It's kind of disturbing the degree to which that he will allow other things. So anyway, so China has that kind of weird. They're I think almost ambivalent, because either way they can work it. But I think they would prefer to have a stable, rational U.S. as a adversary or even part-time ally. Again, the U.S.-China relationship is so deteriorated over the last 4 years because of Donald's utter ineptitude. I don't know. It's going to be difficult to come back, right? You don't get to just pick up where we were before. You have to pick up from where we are, which is a much different place than where we were before. So you can't always act the same way. Donald claimed the same thing that he said many, many, many times in response to this, claiming that he is the last person that Russia wants in office, and that I think the last person is me, and I refer to myself, because nobody's ever been tougher on Russia than I have. Nobody. And this is, again, just that ridiculous lie. I mean, it's an insanely ridiculous lie, as he's never held Russia or Putin responsible. It's continually advocated for them. Even now, as they continue to try and influence our elections, he will go ahead and say, well, China's doing it too, and Iran also cares about stuff. Iran very much doesn't want him to be reelected, and I think that's not an uncommon sentiment among most of the first world countries around the world. So he's going to try and play that, no doubt, further on. So we had some of this, and this is also starting to come out too, and this is how the senators have gotten this info from the Putin-connected allies in Ukraine, and how they've been sharing this information with these folks. and this is Senator Johnson and Chuck Grassley, and they're both trying to claim that no, our investigation into Hunter Biden, which is totally non-political, isn't at all based on this information from these edited phone calls that this guy's trying to sell. And apparently this has been well known, this is known about, and they won't really come clean that they've been hearing about this while they're continuing to try and push these hearings. It's really super sketchy. Now, speaking of Ukraine stuff, we had finally a court ruling. This would have been really nice to have about 6 months ago. We may have saved 100,000 U.S. American lives had they allowed McGahn to testify in the House about his dealings with Donald and how clear it was that he had broken U.S. law and had violated his oath of office in his dealings with Ukraine. So the White House can now Congress can subpoena former White House counsel Don McGahn to testify. This had been the whole dragged out court fight, but had they had to wait until now, they would have had to wait until now to get this ruling to then push for the impeachment hearings. So you had a difficult time there to try and figure out what was the best strategy. And then they got blocked on this and then kept waiting for the courts to resolve it. But again, like saying, it's only till now. We were having some really weird stuff also happen. And this is these same folks who are in charge. And I'll mention another investigation into this. This is the official thing that we're trying to do now with China on this clean network, is what they're calling, to safeguard America's assets. This is the idea that for this next 5th generation 5G network that we build, information network, there are no Chinese parts anywhere or part of it. That it's a, quote, clean network. I could spend probably a whole show talking about some of this clean cloud, clean apps, clean store, clean cable. This idea now that we're going to build and have a whole different internet is a big change from what the internet has always been. And now, essentially what they want to do, and you need to be aware of this, because I don't think this is going to die with just Donald, because there's a lot of people who can make a lot of money off of this. They want to create a closed internet for just us, for just Americans, which is similar to the closed internet that China has. We don't want that. We want an open internet. We want it as open as possible. And this notion of cleanliness may very well be used as a push to try and get that direction going. I'm really concerned about this moving forward. So one of the things that I've talked about a lot over the show is Donald realigning the U.S. with Russia in international politics. And a lot of people are like, well, there's no way that could happen, but he's been doing it over and over and over. And I just think another thing, he has replaced his old horrible ambassador to Germany with a racist Fox commentator, pro-Putin and anti-Merkel, right? Douglas McGregor is his name. This is one of those things where people he sees on Fox, he then picks to go actually do our stuff. And they just become these worse and worse versions of the last thing that was worse. This is actually what Max Boot's article is about. Mike Pompeo is a worse Secretary of State than Rex Tillerson. Mark Meadows is a worse White House Chief of Staff than Reince Priebus, Kelly, or even Mick Mulvaney. Chad Wolf is a worse Secretary of Homeland Security than Christian Nielsen. And Nielsen was the one who was happy to take the kids from their families. Right now, Wolf is the one who's doing tear gas on Americans. Parr is a worse. So again, every time, each one of these iterations, like who would work for him? Who would work for him? It's always worse people. Excuse me. And this continues, again, through some election interference or some really odd stuff. We're going to talk about some more of the stuff that they're doing that's really disturbing. Again, folks, it's hard to really talk about because the news can't really say this, and I'll keep making this clear. Our government is never going to announce that it has become a fascist government. It's going to announce that anti-fascists have become enemies of the state. It's going to announce that Postal Service is now limited to only certain things. It's going to start doling out unemployment funds based on political favors, which is what I'm going to start talking about here in a minute. The Postal Service, and this is what happens, over this last week, he put his new crony in charge, and this guy is, again, there's always been this tension between our private companies and those other corporations like UPS and FedEx that provide these kind of shipping services and the U.S. Postal Service. One, because the Postal Service is a service called for by the Constitution. It's not a private enterprise, and it was never meant or supposed to be some sort of money-making operation. It's always supposed to have been a service that allows people to send packages and letters from one place to another, and that becomes a service of the country. And you have now somebody in charge of it. They did stuff like the Treasury, and I posted this in last week, where Treasury was asking for their private contracts with private things in order to get a loan to help cover some of the coronavirus issues that everybody has been having. Apparently, they've been doing these slowdowns where they're not allowing any overtime to, quote, save costs, which means that mail carriers who have too much, if you have an extra package to take or an extra delivery, you can't go back and get it and take it. You leave it for the next day. So apparently these are starting to pile up in places. The article that I shared was about how they had replaced a number of the senior leadership with new people and did a big shuffle around. And I think a lot of that's going to be to try to keep people from sounding alarm bells as they do this moving forward. One of these articles also mentions how they have changed the bulk rate for ballots. Because again, we're doing a major mail-in election this year. Most of the ballots are going to be sent by mail. They had previously a deal where they were 20 cents per ballot, where they got the bulk rate. But now they're rescinding that, right, at this point, within 90 days of an election. Right? This is not in any way, shape, or form normal. The only thing you can do now is try and challenge it in the courts. And again, the courts take time to work. So they've changed that to now you have to pay the full rate for postage service, which is 55 cents, which is about 3 times the rate. Which means you're going to see a whole bunch more ballots returned for insufficient postage. Ballots. And you're going to have this weird 50-cent poll tax that might very well affect the election. Or at least, again, just create more chaos. And that's one of the things that Donald wants, is the chaos. Because he has now an attorney general who, any time that they need to make a balanced call on the scales are weighted totally. So he knows that he wins any time that he has to do that. So again, create the chaos, create the appearance of nobody knows what's going on. Oh, the Attorney General will solve it for you guys. The rule of law. So, coronavirus relief talks collapse on Capitol Hill as Trump readies executive actions. So it's apparent now, and they actually did fail. And I'll put this. This is an older story from yesterday. They failed. It looks like now that was totally intentional. The GOP had a bunch of money in there that was largely unrelated for military and stuff, and weren't interested in negotiating at all. The Democrats again had passed this bill, this extension of unemployment benefits through the end of the year. I think at least a month ago in the House. McConnell refused to ever take it up or start debating it until the unemployment benefits were running out at the end of last month. Spent 3 days on it before leaving, and now has given up 5 days later. This left the White House to throw these executive orders, which are just nutball crazy. This is like stuff straight out of... And it is straight out of House of Cards. He's essentially saying that, well, they can't negotiate and they're not going to, because he basically told his people, don't negotiate, cause it to fail. He wasn't even there. He'd already gone to his golf course. He's been giving press conferences from his golf course the last couple days. where he has crowds of people there heckling reporters as they're trying to ask questions. That's how ridiculous all of this is, but that's what's happening now. So he goes and he signs these executive orders where he's taking a bunch of FEMA money and he's going to try and force the states to split extending unemployment benefits. Basically 75-25, three-quarters are paid by the feds. The states are picking up somehow this $100 a week per person. Where this money's coming from, who knows? There's multiple issues with this. He's claiming that he's created a payroll tax cut through the end of the year, which, with no funding to replace that money for Medicare or Social Security, what he's essentially done is defund Social Security through the rest of the year, because that's where that money goes to, right? And if you say, well, we're not going to collect that money on the front end, well, how are you paying it on the back end, right? You are literally defunding Social Security. He did this with his executive orders today. All of this. Oh, and he told housing, HUD, housing and HUD, housing and urban development, to encourage landlords not to evict people. Now, this is opposed to the actual legislation that was passed by the Democrats that the Republicans wouldn't look at until a week ago, that would have set up an eviction moratorium across the country. Because again, with the massive unemployment that we've seen, people have had a great deal of time paying their rent. With the now cut of unemployment and benefits, now you have this snowballing economic situation. There is, I think, little doubt in my mind that if Donald loses the election in November, the rest of November and December are going to be extremely uncomfortable for the country, as he just doesn't help anything and does this kind of stuff. He's essentially acting like he's a dictator, like he has the power to do whatever he wants with whatever money. Congress doesn't matter. He can just do it, which he cannot. And that's not the way this country is supposed to be. The situation is pretty dire, and why he's doing a lot of this. Let me give you another quick link here. This is about the unemployment situation in Florida. Florida, under its previous governor, Rick Scott, set up an unemployment situation that was designed, and I'm not saying this, the current governor, Ron DeSantis, is saying this, that the previous governor, although he won't blame him, he's saying somehow the previous situation was set up to deny benefits. Like, the whole system was set up to deny benefits. The system isn't set up to help people who need it. The system is set up to deny benefits. So there's all sorts of weird hoops. You got to do ridiculous amounts of things. The number of people who've been able to successfully enroll for unemployment in Florida is extremely low. Like, so low that the current Republican governor who's against all this stuff is like, yeah, it wasn't my fault. I tried to not do that. So they set up this system to fail, and now it's failing massively, and it's really going to hurt DeSantis. There's no way he's going to get reelected, I don't think. And it very well much could send Florida to Biden, because the response there is just horrible. Like, there's no concerted even notion that government can step in and help during these crises, when that's the whole point of government, is to be there and to provide this assistance when you need it in these times of need. So, continuing on that, we signed this new-ish trade deal between the U.S., Mexico, and Canada, the USMCA. Supposed to be our new free trade deal to replace NAFTA, supposed to be all this. This week, the president decides, again, unilaterally, after we already have a free trade deal, to impose more tariffs on Canadian aluminum. Why? Because the trade deal that he signed didn't have the results that he wanted, so he's got to go back to this I'm doing stuff thing, right? Because again, the idea originally was start the trade war, sign an awesome deal so amazing, everybody loves you. What happened? Trade war, retaliation, sign a deal, end up in the same place you were before, start another trade war. He just has never been able to move the needle on any of these things And as it starts to become apparent, he goes back to the same playbook that he had before. Let's move up a little bit. One other one. Growing side effect of the pandemic, permanent job loss. Yeah, a lot of these jobs that we have right now that are gone, and I think some folks might be thinking that they're just going to come back after the virus goes away, and they're not. We are seeing a big time, again, the pandemic has overshadowed the trade war and the effects of it. And the slowdown from that, and the natural, I think it was probably kind of time for natural business cycle rewind. You had all this extra commercial real estate that was just being unproductive. So there was a lot of just dead money out there waiting to fall off the tree. And COVID acted like a drought coming in to just smash it. And so I think people think we're going to go back to this nice, lush forest, and it's not. I think we're going to be in a desert wasteland for a while now, as again it was in these times, these good times, that the only real legislation that the Republicans have pushed through over the last few years has been a massive corporate tax cut, and they just took all that money and bought their own stuff back, which brings you to the next thing. Buffett. Remember, I mentioned him, Warren Buffett. I've talked about him a few times. Another one of those sociopath billionaires. He buys back $5 billion worth of his own stock to prop up the price because things aren't working so well and he's got so much cash laying around. Now, he did that instead of ending hunger in this country, which is to understand why I call him a sociopath. This is a guy in his, 80s now? How old is he? Yeah, so anyway, he bought back his own stocks. The share repurchase is the most ever in a single period for Buffett. Nearly double the $2.2 billion. I mean, he bought his own. Let me see, how old is he? So why are you doing this? Right? Like, you're 89 years old. And you could have had enough money to end hunger during a pandemic. And a lot of families are feeling hunger and they're feeling these dangers. But instead you buy back $5 billion of your own stock. That's not a moral choice in any sense. And I think our country needs to face the facts that the people who make these choices are not good people. You know, again, we've talked about this before. You know, how, if I had this money, you do this. So many people, you would never get there because when you got halfway or a tenth of the way there, you'd see a real problem with the world to solve and realize that your money was just that, just a thing that you can solve problems with, not a measure of your personal worth, right? Which is where I think Zuckerberg and some of these other people have just gone crazy. That they think it's somehow their penis length or somehow measured into that, and that's not at all how it works. All right, permanent job loss. Private equity firm bought Ancestry.com and its trove of DNA for $4.7 billion. This is problematic to me. This whole thing, we've got some real intellectual property issues around DNA and genes that need to be sorted out, and hopefully in a way that doesn't make this a good purchase for them. I don't know what else they might be doing. This stuff always speaks of some weird ulterior motives. I know that there's some weird fine print in some of those DNA testing things that include that kind of, if you have this weird special gene that we happen to identify or this weird mutation, we own the rights to that, right? And there's some weird stuff there, and that's why, again, they bought Ancestry.com for $4.7 billion. That's not a small amount of money for a firm. And it's Blackstone Group, so it's one of those weird, like, super money groups that's out there. There was another thing that happened this last week, too. The president, with this whole TikTok situation, somehow claiming that the Treasury deserves a finder's fee for forcing this government, a foreign government, to sell to a U.S. firm, and then we get a cut of that. This screams fascism, folks. Like, how can he not then do that to anybody? right? Why can't you say any technology company, any other firm, any shipping company, any industrial company, say, no, you got to sell. You can't be here anymore. Based on what, right? This whole notion that we have rules of law, that you have something that, there's something other than this one person's say-so. And so much of this is I think it's just kind of bum rush, folks, that they don't realize, like, why? How can he just do that? And the answer is, well, no. Nominally, I mean, we're in a world where people are allowed free action, so he can say those words. Do they take effect? Not really. And you're seeing this huge disparity between particularly his political supporters who think he does have that power to just say that he has the authority to cut taxes, right? And then he can just write his pen and then, I've cut taxes now, which is what he claimed to have done. I just did this. I have the authority to just do that. And there are things that the president does have that authority to do, but most of the things that he's trying to do are not. That's why it's just so frustrating to deal with and talk about. All right, ready as executive actions. All right, choo. Former clients of acting Homeland Security Chief Chad Wolf received millions in department contracts. You may have seen this guy justifying the tear gas of innocent people a little while ago when he was calling peaceful protesters anarchists and terrorists. He is also making bank doing this. So if you don't think that a lot of the reason why these people do this is just flat out for millions and millions of dollars, you're wrong. That's largely what a lot of them do this for. Under the notion that money will insulate them and protect, ultimately. Like it did Donald. In another shakeup, State Department's acting Inspector General resigns amid Pompeo probes. After fewer than 3 months on the job, the State Department's acting Inspector General has resigned. And another major shakeup. I mentioned this before. This is the one the Inspector General was inspecting, generally, Mike Pompeo and his wife and some of the ways that they were abusing government services, and that guy got fired by Donald. The guy who replaced him was supposed to be a toady to come clean up. He quit. That's what this is about. This whole situation where you take these active investigations, you replace the person who's been doing it with some active investigations, I should say, replace them with some acting person, and then that person's gone. So you take this investigation, give it to this other person, then they're gone. Now somebody new's here, and they don't know anything that's happened. And let's just start fresh, guys. Let's just start fresh. That's what's going on, and they've realized that they can just, all these people, and you're like, oh, well, if these all people have to be replaced, at will, and I can just replace them at will, then I can replace them at will so often that they can never really do their job. That's the kind of corruption that we're starting to see now. There's a nice story about the CFPB. This is one of those ideas and just cautionary tales, if you will. The CFPB, the Consumer Financial Protection Bureau, the amount of money that they've recovered for consumers since Donald's people has taken over has dropped by about 90%. It's like 6% of what it used to be. Like it used to be 100%, and now it's 6%. What they were given by, again, the legislation dreamed up and what it passed, one of the things that Obama administration was able to do after the economic crisis was create this entire federal bureau that was supposed to protect consumers from predatory lending. Again, the problem with politics is when you lose power to appoint the person who runs it, and the person who was running it before was Mulvaney, who hated it and voted against it and wanted to destroy it forever. And then he was the acting chief again. So you have this acting chief, and now you have somebody else come in, and mainly what it's doing now is protecting, like moneylenders, protecting the quick cash loan people, right? And they change the rules so they can now also get in on some of the PPP stuff and start easing the economic burden that people are feeling by providing liquidity and loans. at 500% rates and getting more people. As you have this economic situation, more people get more desperate, more people end up in these just broken, impossible loans. And that's what the whole thing was with some of these lending stuff. So when you lost the control of that organization, you lost the power to enforce the laws and do it that way. We'll switch on to our last third of stuff we have here. 100% of Colorado is now experiencing drought conditions. If you are around where I have been, and we got 90 degrees for the next days, no rain on the horizon for the next 10 days. It's going to be rough. Warm August. We'll go a little bit more campaign stuff here and talk a little bit more COVID as we go to this, but the climate change is still real, still happening, still real, still happening. I don't know. We were good here in Colorado a year ago. Now a year later, we're not, and so we'll see how we look a year from now. Right? We're at the mercy of powers beyond our control. There was one of the silliest things ever, and I posted about this. Silliest things ever. You might say, that's a bit much, Roy. Yes, but Joe Biden can apparently hurt God. Now, I don't know how you're supposed to even theoretically be able to, as a mortal being, hurt God, but apparently Joe Biden has that ability. Now, Biden is a lifelong Catholic. He's, again, welcome to his faith. Good for it. It's not something that I don't think I've ever seen him beat anybody over the head with in the slightest. And so Donald trying to bash him and claim that he's trying to hurt God is just... that's a level of political rhetoric that's insanity. And the response from so many Republicans is that, well, yes, you must be absolutely civil in return and you can't do any... Joe Biden wants to hurt God. And it's like, well, what does that even make sense? Quick little news update. There was a article you may have seen about this seal museum using a Kaepernick jersey for dogs to attack. I know, horrible. Anyway, the Seals cut ties with them. I was just going to cover that real quick. Oh, the Census Bureau. So this is what's going on too. I mentioned this previous show, how they're trying to cut short the time by a month that they're doing these in-person follow-ups to get the counts. Now there's a memo going around at the Census Bureau about ways to computationally calculate undocumented citizen counts. So the idea would then be they come up with a formula to identify how many of the people that they did count were undocumented citizens, and then, because they've had a directive by the president to not count those people, subtract that number from their actual count. So you need to understand how big the malfeasance can get here and how bad it is when the people who are doing the counting start to cheat. Because that's the idea. And then you can say, oh, well, there's this certain percentage in this place and a certain percentage in this place. And now all of a sudden you've seen that they've done bigger subtractions in certain areas and have then justified that by, well, Democrats don't really care about those kind of people. And that's like where they are already. And they're putting out these memos to justify this kind of thing. And then they're sending this information around to people. And normally the census kind of stuff, there's a bit of secrecy about the numbers because they are so important. But now they're asking these numbers and counts and estimates to be put out before so that the Commerce Department and other places can verify that the numbers are going to look the way they want them to. Right? Not that there's a desire for the direct and most accuracy, but that there is a direct intent for result. So I still think the census is going to have to be done. We apparently did less COVID tests this week as we did last week, which should be disturbing for anybody who understands that understanding the total scope and extent of the virus is the only way we're ever going to get any kind of control, unless we're just waiting for everyone to get sick, which is absurd. So this might go to something that Donald's been talking about, where if we do less testing, less people find out about it. A couple of people around him tested positive this week, a little bit closer, including Governor Mike DeWine. And then I guess he tested negative later. But they also, a school that Pence had been at a couple weeks ago to crow about reopening, had to shut down. We're going to talk a little bit more about those here in a second. Georgia student who posted photo in a crowded school hallway, and no longer suspended. No longer suspended. See, that's one of the things. So this happened too, 'cause Georgia went back to school, and this photo started showing around of these really just crowded hallways in between classes during times. The student apparently got suspended for taking a picture for, student privacy rules and violating having a phone in between classes. Which apparently wildly worse than opening up and forcing schools to open in a dangerous situation. There's been another couple hundred schools. The Georgia School District will now offer only virtual learning after 90 staff members, are forced to quarantine. I mean, we're getting close here to try and open it up here. I don't think it's going to even be possible, because anybody's going to try, you're going to see this already. We haven't seen numbers popping out of Georgia schools because Georgia schools are barred from telling people how many people to show up. And every news story that talks about this needs to mention, like, we've been trying to get numbers for how many people have tested positive after this first week, but the Georgia Department of Education will not release any information whatsoever. So everything that's coming out about positive test cases related to these school openings is coming out other ways, not from the schools themselves. Which, if you think about that for a few minutes, that should really bother you. So that's the other thing that happened this week too. Facebook and others finally started saying, no, you can't just lie. You can't use our services to tell dangerous lies to people. And the dangerous lie that the president trying to sell this week is that kids are immune to the virus, or, quote, largely immune, which is some weird play on how English works. Well, it's like almost, it's, pretty much perfect, totally perfect. Oh, well, yeah, but perfect. But yeah, everybody some people think it's perfect. Anyway, they took down one of his posts for trying to claim that this was real, because they want to, try and get everybody to act like it's normal so the economy comes back so he can win, because that had been the thing that was protecting him in a lot of ways. Now he has all of his white supremacist folks who are really happy that they can be racist again, and they got somebody to make them feel good about that. But a lot of his more mainstream, white male suburban support came from, and especially upper class, was the economy, and that was a very good protection for him. And with that going down, there's a lot more people exposed. And like the white working class, non-college educated folks who seem to like him, I think that was the really big insulator there. Not necessarily directly, because a lot of those white working class, non-college educated Trump supporters are older than they don't work anymore. So the degree to which any of his decisions actually affect them is less than one would have thought, which is why you get this so far going. So anyway, the day after he starts doing this, Facebook takes his moves, then a 7-year-old dies in Georgia from the virus. And that's the thing. There's some other stuff about part of why it's been less deadly for younger kids, having to do with how the virus enters the body and what receptors it attacks. We'll see. This experiment's going to go on for another couple weeks. The data's going to come out, I think, more next week as we see more stuff happening. And then finally, on the Trump campaign, there was this article about how they're doing a bunch of door knocks and Joe Biden's campaign is not doing door knocks, which is a traditional campaign activity. Well, I don't know how much door knocks are going to matter in 2020. The virtual campaign, I think, is, we're in the 21st century now. And I think it's odd, too, that we're in a situation where politically some people might be more receptive to people coming to the door, but these are generally antisocial people anyway. And whereas the people who are the socialists don't want anybody to come near them. It's kind of funny if you think about it. But the campaign is continuing. It's shaping up pretty... I mean, let me give you an idea of how odd it is. One of the states that was just moved to toss-up status, right? Toss-up is Texas. Like, Texas is somehow a toss-up in this election cycle. And the only way that happens is if the whole country shifted about 4 points to the left. Which is what I think Donald has ultimately pretty much done at this point. So we'll see how that holds, but he's really trying to do as many levers as he can to get whatever advantage that they can. The Postal Service stuff is really, really disturbing. Changing the rates for ballots. The executive order stuff on unemployment and evictions. One, because it creates this notion that somehow this is an okay way to do this. Like, this is all can just be done with executive orders and there's no reason for a Congress. And I think pretty clearly if Donald is reelected, he's not going to ever really talk to Congress anymore. Because now, I mean, we're in the middle of a crisis, a big crisis, one of the biggest ones the country's faced, and he's refusing to negotiate with Congress. So if he won't do it now, and if there's nothing that's going to be any give and take to make this work with the people who represent the vast majority of the voters in this country, and when. So, 86 days to escape dystopia for this big opportunity for us. Very clearly what we need to be doing. That pretty much finishes up for tonight. Kind of quiet, I guess, ultimately. I was trying to do a little bit different format tonight. Not quite as chaotic. And a little bit more organized. We'll see how that works out. Hope everybody enjoyed the show. And have a great Saturday night. And a wonderful week. Make sure your voting registration's up to date. Make sure you get your ballot in early. And you're probably going to have to put 2 stamps on it if you send it in the mail. Because they are cheating. Have a good night.